Welcome to the Alayli podcast, your go-to podcast for exploring the diverse fields driving space exploration and technology. I'm your host, Omar Alayli, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Ralph Fritsche, a leader in NASA's Deep Space Crop Production Program. Now retired from NASA, Ralph is supporting the development of food system concepts for deep space exploration. Ralph, it's fantastic to have you here today.
Hi, Omar. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about some of the topics that I'm pretty passionate about.
Okay, Ralph, my listeners might think of astronaut food purely in terms of those vacuum sealed packs. But as we plan for longer missions, like years long journeys to Mars, that model becomes unsustainable. So let's start with the big picture. You've highlighted that the current prepackaged food system has limitations for missions beyond 18 months or so due to nutrition degradation and perhaps menu fatigue. From your strategic perspective, how fundamental is developing in situ food production, like growing plants, to enabling true long duration human exploration missions?
Well, first, let me say that the folks at NASA at the Johnson Space Center are doing everything they can to not only extend the shelf life and the nutrient content of the prepackaged food, they're also looking to add variety and different menu options. So I don't see that going away anytime soon. I think what we're referring to now for these longer duration missions is that we really haven't demonstrated a food storage technology where it will maintain all the nutrient requirements for anything over 3 years. They're trying to extend it to 5 years. And so, in order to be safe and hedge our bets, we looked at plant production, crop production as being a opportunity to be able to supplement that prepackaged food. So that's kind of where the focus has been in the near term for NASA. But then if we think beyond that, if we start talking about surface systems on the moon and Mars,
Mhm.
eventually you're looking to somewhat cut that cord back to earth and resupply. And that's where the concept of in situ food production comes in. And as you start hearing people talk about larger and larger outposts leading into what you could potentially realize as a colony, then it makes even more sense. Now you've got the opportunity for the plant's perspective case, at least, to not only be an extra source of nutrition in the diet, but also for doing atmospheric regeneration and water purification. So there's the concept then at some point you start really moving into the realm of a complete self-contained biodiversity system. You're looking at a bioregenerative life support. So it's all on this timeline that
Mhm.
we really are trying to understand where we deploy things according to the timeline.
Okay. So beyond just calories and vitamins, there's a human element. Astronauts like Scott Kelly have shared how much tending plants like the zinnias meant to them. How significant are these psychological benefits? The connection to Earth, the fresh smells and textures in NASA's planning for the crew's well-being on isolated missions.
So I think this is a good question. I think what we're seeing now is that while the focus for the plant research that we did initially was on the food production side of things, we realized as well, but was harder to quantify, is the psychosocial benefits of having plants along in that environment with them. And that is something that different groups are looking at not only from the food side, but also from the air purification side of the crew habitat. Been papers that have been released recently about the microbial diversity within the International Space Station, and it's a pretty sanitary environment, and that has its own potential areas of question and concern. So bringing things like plants along can help improve that diversity, as well as just the pure enjoyment of being around plants. But one of the things we talked about back in the days when I was working for NASA in the office is that having plants along can be also a double-edged sword. If crew members really get attached to the growing of the plants and then they don't do well, now
Yeah.
so we have to make sure that everything that we deploy is a reliable system, again, free of pathogens. It's going to keep the crew environment healthier than it was before we introduced the plants. So yeah, I think the psychosocial social aspects are big. We've even talked about the possibility that they could be the tipping point and motivation for us actually deploying plants early on when there's a lot of competition still for resources and space allocation. It very well may be the psychosocial benefits that tip it over the edge.
Very interesting. Now, Ralph, to ensure that our audience is on the same page, could you briefly explain what we mean by deep space food crop systems? What does that encompass beyond just planting seeds?
Okay, so when we talk about the deep space aspects, we're really thinking about going beyond low Earth orbit. So, what the Artemis program is starting to open up the horizons for actual return to the moon and a permanent stay on the moon. Then, when we
Hmm.
think beyond that to going to Mars, the journey to Mars because of the duration of time with the current propulsion technology, as well as the time there. So, anything beyond low Earth orbit is what we consider deep space for the food production perspective.
Okay. We often hear terms like controlled environment agriculture, something like hydroponics and aeroponics mentioned in this context. Could you demystify these technologies for us? What are they and why are they so crucial for space farming compared to traditional soil?
Okay, so another good question. So when we think of the hardware that NASA has used up to date for plant production, I think the ones that come to mind in recent times are the veggie payload and the advanced plant habitat. Both of those use a substrate, a media that allows not only the roots to have anchor points, but also for them to get access to water and nutrients. It's a real challenge because of the behavior in water and microgravity to ensure that the root zones of plants will have access to that water. Water will tend to form a blob in space. You've seen a lot of these illustrations by astronauts like Don Pettit doing that kind of work, and Chris Hadfield. And so, in cases like that, if the roots get immersed inside a water blob, they will be drowning in that excess of water. And conversely, if the roots aren't exposed to the water, they will dry up. So, what we've done with both veggie and advanced plant habitat is try to figure out how do I um, distribute the water within the media that we've provided so that the plants have access to them.
Mhm.
And there's also a way to, with the media, to include fertilizers so we can give them the nutrients they need. Now, the problem with that is both for the veggie and advanced plant habitat payloads, that substrate is pretty much a single use substrate. So you're flying up this extra mass. In the case of veggies, they're plant pillows. In the case of the advanced plant habitat, it's an actual root module. So there's some weight associated with that. And since it's not reusable, it's not sustainable. So when we start thinking about going beyond low Earth orbit, we're always trying to think with sustainability as a foundational principle. And so now we're trying to figure out how do we get away from these single use, heavy, non sustainable ways to grow plants into something that's more sustainable. And actually, NASA was on the forefront of that back 20, 30, 40 years ago with hydroponics. And we started at the Kennedy Space Center, doing studies with them that actually led to the first vertical farm.
Mhm.
And we actually learned how to grow potatoes in nutrient film techniques without soil.
Mhm.
So that becomes a way now if you can start figuring out how you can grow plants in microgravity without a media in such a way that the plants can thrive and survive in a and get access to water and nutrients, that becomes the most desirable solution. So doing that is challenging in microgravity, or even maybe a little bit less challenging in partial gravity environments, but we haven't really gotten there yet,
Mhm.
because we have to maintain and contain that water. And so aeroponics, which is basically spraying a water mist over the root zone,
Mhm.
is a way to do that. We would have the roots growing in a contained in space, and you can scavenge the water that the plants don't take up back. Similarly, for a hydroponic system, there are ways that you can hydroponically provide water to plants even in a microgravity environment.
Mhm.
Technical ways of doing it that we've been studying and working with. But again, the rationale for doing that is to be able to do things without a media. And so this is a case where what you see going on in vertical agriculture and controlled environment agriculture, there are similar aims going on. If I think of vertical farms, you will see usually two different scenarios. Either they're walls with the plants are going up and down along the walls, and that's how they distribute the water and nutrients to them, or they're shelves and vertically stacked. So in
Mhm.
those cases, they're making the most use of the volume that the building that they're in is providing. And if I think of being on the surface of the moon or Mars, it's likely we're going to have to do the same kind of thing. We have to maximize the use of the volume we're given. And so if I think of a soil, even if I start talking about regolith and what it takes to convert regolith, or the material that's local to the moon and to Mars, different formulations, obviously, but we call them both regolith. And so if I take that lunar regolith or soil and I bring it into a habitat, it still has to have a certain depth for the root zone to take place. And it really becomes something it's a lot more challenging to think about stacking that. And so
Mhm.
it makes a better area solution. So until the day comes that I can have large deployable habitats that have a lot of area, I think hydroponics and aeroponics, they become a very attractive solution. Now, that it doesn't mean that it's the only way of doing it. We actually have a system that's being developed right now and finalized at the Kennedy Space Center called the OAP014 payload. And that's going to be the first crop production system that's designed specifically for crop production as opposed to plant research and then harvesting some of those plants for crew consumption. And one of the purposes behind the Ohio spacecraft payload was to actually investigate the whole way and the options and approaches for handling water and nutrient delivery into the root zone. And one of the techniques that's being investigated is being championed by Utah State University. They won an award to pursue this, and it'll be actually the first demonstration with Ohio, is using a long fiber peat, which happens to be something that, even though it's a media based and has that weight penalty associated with it, is reusable. And we're creating a good soil with a good microbiome for the soil. So that becomes a case where now does it make sense, because of the sustainability of the soil substrate, to use actual media based system for microgravity. So we're looking at a whole range of options and really now taking the time to figure out which one works best. So there's a competition right now between a hydroponics, aeroponics, and some of these long fiber peat solutions. And it's going to take actual demonstration and research on orbit to really flesh out which ones are probably the best. And it may even vary for different types of plants that we're working on, especially if I'm looking at root zone crops as opposed to crops to grow above the root zone.
Okay, great. Ralph, you come from a physics and space background, later moving into engineering and operations before leading crop production. You've described managing this interdisciplinary effort like leading an orchestra. How does that unique perspective shape your strategic approach to balancing the needs of plant scientists with the constraints faced by engineers building space hardware?
Yeah, I think it's another good question. When I got involved in the life science payload world, I came from a background of strictly engineering hardware. And so it was a fairly quick learning experience to realize that now I've been inserted into a group of plant biologists, and the comfort they have in the area of plants would fade away when they got into the engineering side of things. And then similarly, when you brought the engineers in there, they really didn't have a good appreciation for biology. So it really takes a certain amount of time to educate both parties about what the other's needs and capabilities are. Often the plant scientists would come in and they would put a list of requirements or desirements on the hardware people, and some of those were not possible to meet. And so the hardware people would come back and say, well, why do you need to do this biological aspect of this science? And the engineers just didn't understand the way biology works. And so I think that that's actually been a really good lesson for me, because what it's told me is that when you look just in the technology of how do you grow plants in space, that's the issue that pops up with the two different cultures just when you zoom in on that. But when you step back and you now look and consider food systems as a whole, where it's not just any single technology, it's all the issues that would come into play for food systems, you see the same thing blown up exponentially, because now I have people pushing certain production technologies, maybe because it's their idea, maybe because they have financial backing to do so. But at the same time, a food system isn't going to be any one production technology. And you have
Okay.
to bring in the nutritionists, you have to bring in the chefs, the people who are going to prepare the food. And there's a lot of different factors at play. And
Hmm.
that's where it becomes really interesting, because no one group who's working in this arena has the ability to necessarily stop and look up and see the big picture. And so
Hmm.
that's kind of where my interest has been lately.
Okay, great. From our conversation last time, your strategic end nowadays is to evaluate and develop a roadmap and timeline on developing and integrating fundamental systems that are going to be supplemental for nutrition and plants on long duration off world missions. So let me ask you, strategically, how does your approach differ when planning food crop systems for a lunar base versus a multi year Mars mission? Are the priorities and challenging the challenges fundamentally different?
Well, I think what happens is, when I look at this timeline, you can go out there on LinkedIn or various other platforms, and you can see artists' conceptions of future habitation modules, sometimes at a colony scale, and they will have a lot of infrastructure laid out. And one of the ones that I saw recently that I really got a kick out of was this, what looked to almost to be the size of the big warehouse. And
Hmm.
all they were doing were growing some type of leafy green vegetables, and I think carrots. And then in front of this big infrastructure greenhouse, they had a plate with leafy vegetables and carrots. And when I look back and I say to myself, this is really giving a false impression. We're not going to be spending that much infrastructure, time, resources, energy to make one little plate of vegetables, in this case leafy greens. It
Hmm.
was a portion of the salad to feed crews. So the whole idea of roadmaps is an effort to kind of put some reality into the situation, because I think from the standpoint of how we've laid out a timeline, we haven't really done a good job of explaining the different steps along the way. And so our goal now is to look at potential scenarios, and these will be driven by not only the resources we have available, they'll be driven by the crew stay time and the crew size as well. And so when you start talking about these different size efforts, that's going to either limit or open up a range of technologies for inclusion. And so
Hmm.
that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to say, and we're trying to figure out what makes the most appropriate demonstration or mission scenarios that we can come up with. But you can think of crews of 4 to 6 people. And the odds are, in something small like that, when most of the time is really being dedicated to exploration, whether it's the moon or Mars, you're going to have most of your food prepackaged and sent there. You might be doing the research in a partial gravity and in the radiation environment into crop production or other food production technologies, but it'll
Hmm.
be very much on a demonstration and an approving aspect of those technologies. Then when you get up to crews of 40 people, let's say 40, 50 people, now you have the ability to, because you'll have the size, you'll have the resources to consider food production as a way to supplement the diet that those crew members get. And also at that point, you'll probably have the ability to have dedicated crew member or two to do the food preparation, and as well as the nutritional assessment analysis of what the other crew members will need to do. Ultimately, at the end of the day, regardless of the crew size, anywhere in the near term where you're under 100, 200 people, you're going to be wanting to look at aspects of not only personalized health, but personalized nutrition. And how
Hmm.
can I select, tailor, and modify the food ingredients that these people are getting so that it can actually meet the targeted needs that they have on an individual basis. So it's coming up with different models that fit the scenario, that now people who are working in the food area can say, okay, I can see how my technology would fit in this application, or
Hmm.
my technology doesn't fit in this application. We have a lot of people who are working different points along the timeline because the vision that they have in their head, but they're doing it without any roadmap
Hmm.
telling them to do so or helping them along the way. They're doing it just because that's what their vision, I think, you know, brings them to do.
Okay, great. That gives us a great foundation. Let's zoom in now on the specific systems and research you were managing at NASA's Kennedy Space Center, starting with the hardware that is actually flying right now. As you mentioned, on the International Space Station, NASA operates two key plant growth facilities, the Veggie and the Advanced Plant Habitat. They seem quite different. Veggie often described as a space garden and the APH as a high tech lab. Could you compare their goals and perhaps share a story about a specific challenge or success encountered with operating each one in microgravity?
Yeah, sure. Again, if I think to set the stage, it's got to be clear that both Veggie and Advanced Plant Habitat were research facilities. And really, at the beginning, it was just to fundamentally understand plant performance in that microgravity environment and look at it so that you could get plant samples back, do analysis, understand, what that environment was doing, both in terms of potential mutations to plants, to plant performance, see how they were actually doing. And so that's at a deeper science level than I got involved in. But if I step back and look at the differences between those two systems, Veggie was a very simple system. It was open to the cabin environment, so it
Hmm.
required regular watering by crew members, and actually the environmental control and life support system of the International Space Station itself would be what was taking the transpired water from the veggie plants that were growing and bringing them back in. And so very simple, open. Again, the plant pillows that are what grow within the veggie payload are pre-loaded on the ground with seeds. They have a media called arsenite, which is a substrate that just allows, like we talked about earlier, water to get to the root zone of the plants. And then all that was really left of veggie is a light cap. So it provided the lighting that the veggie plants would need. And then it was also had a variable height, so that as the plants grew, you could keep the distance between the leaf top, the canopy
Hmm.
from the lights to be the same. So very simple system, and far less expensive than advanced plant habitat was. And again, one thing about veggie is each veggie unit requires a mid-deck locker space, so it
Hmm.
takes up less space. Something on the order of a small microwave in terms of space. Advanced plant habitat, on the other hand, completely different philosophy. This is a closed system. So now the environment of internal to the advanced plant habitat is maintained by the advanced plant habitat. It's not the ISS environment that you
Hmm.
have with veggie. And as such, far more complicated. Instead of a single mid-deck locker size volume for veggie, you have a quad locker, four lockers for advanced plant habitat. And at least two, a little bit more than two of those lockers are filled up with hardware to maintain that environment. So the growth area is bigger than veggie, but it's not significantly bigger than veggie. You also have a lot of different sensors. You have the ability to control and monitor the environment and tailor the environment and adjust it. You have imaging sensors internal to it, so it's far more sensor heavy, a far more complex and better research system than veggie is. But both are
Hmm.
capable of growing plants. You can grow more plants within advanced plant habitat, and it's the more advanced research system.
Okay. Astronauts have now eaten lettuce, radishes, and even chili peppers grown on the International Space Station. From a management standpoint, what did it take to get from growing plants experimentally to actually having them certified as safe for crew consumption?
Um, I actually was not closely involved in that certification process, but I know that it was a combination of astronauts, feeling that if they were going to spend the time in growing these plants, they would sure like to be able to eat them. So there was help from literally from above, and then it was for us to demonstrate with ground testing that and the samples we got from back from previous veggie flights that they were safe to eat. Now the one mitigation strategy that was invoked by the folks within the agency responsible for crew health and safety was that we had to go there, and for leafy green vegetables, for example, we
Hmm.
had to use a wipe, a Prosan wipe, to actually disinfect the leaves before crew consumption. So the crew members would wipe down the plants beforehand. And that was, the reports we got back were that wasn't necessarily one of their favorite activities was to use that. So that opens up the next and probably the most important aspect of producing anything in the space environment is how do we ensure the safety of it?
Hmm.
And there's there's been a historic, I guess, perspective within NASA that when I look at everything we send to space, we try to minimize any of the microbes we bring up. And so there's been this, to put it cavalierly, this concept that the only good microbe is a dead microbe. But when it comes to food, that's not the case. And even for the long-term viability and health of crew members and the built environment that you're sending up there, that's probably not the best scenario.
Hmm.
So how do you compensate? How do you monitor the microbial diversity in a platform, whether that's the vehicle itself or whether that's the food production area, to ensure that you don't have the pathogens in there that could potentially make crew members sick? That is a huge aspect going forward with everything. It's a lot more challenging being in a space flight environment if someone gets ill due to a food issue than it would be
Hmm.
back here. Neither of them are desirable, but we definitely want to do everything we can to prevent that in the space environment.
True. Ralph, beyond the International Space Station, a lot of critical work happens on the ground at the Kennedy Space Center, and especially at its plant processing area. Can you give us a glimpse into the research? What kind of testing and technology development happens there before anything flies?
Yeah, so there's the hardware side of things, and then there's the biology side of things. And I would say if probably since we're a very heavily influenced in the plant biology side of things, let's talk about that.
Hmm.
It's really a matter of identifying the types of plants that we want to send to space that we think will have an impact on crew diet, and and going through that selection process. So we've just released a technical paper on how many plants we think we would like to take with us eventually, and kind of a summary of all the different plants that we've evaluated. Some passed on ground testing and failed in space, and others, made it all the way through. So there is a scale that we look at. It's called the crop readiness level, that has a number of iterative steps in the process to validate something for spaceflight, with the goal eventually that once they've flown and demonstrated that they're at the highest readiness level, so we can bring them forward. Nothing obviously has been tested in a partial gravity environment. So once we get to the surface of the moon, we're going to have to do additional testing. But it's really been a way of trying to identify and narrow down the plants based on their performance, based on their nutritional content, their palatability. We've done all kinds of other research with plants, trying to understand, for example, how do I maximize the edible portion of a plant at the expense of the non-edible portion? We've looked at things like dwarf tomatoes, uh, dwarf fruits even. How do I, grow tomatoes where I prioritize the production of fruit and at the expense of the stems and the leaves that are not necessarily edible? We've also looked at ways to uh, accelerate the production of plants that would enable quick nutrient delivery to crew members. And so one of the simplest ways to do that is by growing microgreens. We've not yet demonstrated microgreens in space. There may be challenges with those, but the thing about microgreens that from a initial first blush look is that makes them interesting is that you have a lot of variety of plants, you have a lot of variety of flavors. Microgreens are just really the early phase of growth of a lot of traditional crop plants. And so you're looking at a couple of weeks. And during that period of time, most of the plants have their energy that they need to grow within the seeds themselves. So they don't need much light. Again, they first are growing, and light doesn't really become an issue for the germination process.
Hmm.
So the resources required to grow the microgreens are less. You can get them quicker, and they have all the nutrients within them. The
Hmm.
big challenge with microgreens is the fact that, first of all, you need a lot of seeds to do that, which could be an issue. And then how do those seeds survive in long term in when I start going away and outside low Earth orbit, I get that exposure to the radiation environment. How long do they last in terms of what's the germination percentage over time? And then also the fact that the closer you get to the root zone where the roots would be and where you would grow the plants on,
Hmm.
the higher potential for contamination or food safety issues raising their heads. So nothing is a perfect solution. And
Hmm.
again, we're looking at variety of approaches. So really, if you go to the plant processing area at the Kennedy Space Center, any one day or month, you might see research in a different direction, in a different aspect, whether it's crop selection, whether it's novel plant selections, whether it's sensors. We've also looked at evaluating things like hyperspectral imaging sensors to get early detection of plant stress, plant health. So
Hmm.
it's a combination of things. And again, we're reacting and responding and doing research there based on grants that have been awarded. So a lot of times it's not necessarily the idea of the work from the people and the plant scientists at Kennedy, but
Hmm.
it's the work that NASA organization who's funded the plant research has different investigators research being conducted there. So it can vary over time.
Let me follow up on this. I've noticed that there's a shift from focusing on staples like wheat towards supplemental pick and eat crops for current missions. What drove that strategic shift?
Oh, that's straightforward and easy. We're focused on pick and eat crops now because literally you can grow them, pick them, eat them. When I start talking about staple crops, now those are crops that usually have to be harvested on a larger scale. There's a certain amount of processing that is required. We don't have the processing hardware for that, and then we don't have the preparation hardware if they have to be cooked, etc. So that the staple crops come in later on when I'm in a surface in setting. They would not make sense in low Earth orbit
Hmm.
as a way to rely on.
Hmm.
To grow them and demonstrate them, that's a different story. But staple crops really won't be a viable option for a food system approach until we actually have the infrastructure and resources where we can, actually do the harvesting, processing, and preparation effectively.
How much is the end user, the astronauts, involved in this research?
I think that the long-term research that we're looking at, not not much at this
Hmm.
point. I think the astronauts are involved when they see what we've actually are growing and they can interact with it. So
Hmm.
but we try to do sensory testing before we actually fly anything. The worst case scenario is that you fly something and you spent all this money and effort, trying to validate the performance of this one plant type or plant cultivar. And then when
Hmm.
it actually gets on orbit, no one wants to eat it because it doesn't taste good. So we're always looking at validating the palatability as well as the nutritional content of what
Hmm.
we provide so that we're fairly confident that astronauts are going to enjoy it.
Okay. Your team developed innovations like seed film, embedding seeds in dissolvable strips for easier planting. Could you tell us about that project and other key technology developments aimed at tackling space challenges, particularly around water systems like ponds and PWM?
Okay, so wow, you put a lot in there. So seed film. So that's an interesting thing. We actually have a room off of our main plant production area. We call it Greenworks,
Hmm.
and it was a place for us to just, when we would sit in the office and have a few minutes to talk, share our ideas and approaches. And one day we were talking about, the challenge with handling seeds in microgravity. If we had to go and take seeds from some container to plant, because we're now going in repetitive plantings, whether that's hydroponically or within some other approach, and losing those seeds, now they're floating around in the cabin environment. They're getting sucked into the air filtration system. And so not a desirable thing. And one of my colleagues he's replaced me in my position after I retired, Trent Smith, he was a polymer chemist.
Hmm.
And he got the idea popped into his head about, how you could use a pull-in polymer to embed seeds in. And it's kind of like the breath strips that they used to have that would dissolve in your mouth. And so
Okay.
he got some of the components and was able to cast some of these films
Hmm.
and embed seeds in them, and you could actually inoculate them with nutrients as well within the polymer, and they grew fine. And the vision there was that you could have a seed bank of sorts on a future spacecraft that, and if you wanted to grow a selection of a specific kind of crop, you could just pull out a film and
Hmm.
then go from there, and you wouldn't have to worry about having seeds flying around in the cabin or in a module, because once you lay the film out and you wet it, the film dissolves and then the seeds can do their thing and grow. Then you talked about ponds and plant water management.
Plant
So
water management, yeah.
PWM, right? So ponds is an approach. I really haven't worked with that much. I know, again, it's a way of trying to grow individual plants, and provide them the access to the air and water they need in the root zone in a sustainable way. Um, Plant water management was looking at alternative approaches to watering plants, and one of them that was very intriguing, and I don't know what the current status of it is since I left, was using microfluidics, capillary action principles to actually contain the water in an open vessel,
Hmm.
such that just the capillary nature of the fluid would keep it within the vessel, so you could have it open and you could have a water nutrient solution flowing along the plant roots
Hmm.
and have an open system, not have to have it closed or contained. And it was ideas that were worked by Dr. Mark Weislogel, who at the
Hmm.
time was in Portland State, I think. I don't want to get that wrong. He's now branched off, has his own company, and brilliant guy, super interesting, exciting guy to be around and listen to.
Hmm.
And he actually engineered, I believe it was just him, but he or his group at Portland State engineered the cappuccino cup that the Italian astronaut got to drink out of. She didn't want to drink cappuccino out of a straw, and so
Hmm.
they engineered this cup. And there's a great video on, you can probably still find it on YouTube, where one of the crew members has this little cup full of cappuccino and tosses it to the another crew member, and this thing is spinning and floating and rotating, and the liquid stays inside the cup. So it was a similar principle to that. And part of the challenge with everything we do is that there's limited funding, there's limited people capable of supporting these different research tasks.
Hmm.
And so it's often a case where you have a really good idea, but because of competition and in funding across the board within the agency, sometimes there's a threshold. You might have 10 really great ideas that you want to go to have funded through our awards or grants process. And at the end of the day, to move on to the next tier of validations, the next level of fidelity, of those 10, you may only get to select 2 or 3. And so it's what happens to the other 7 or 8. That's sometimes can be disappointing, because ideas that you think are really good and novel may not make it all the way. Not because of merit, just because of the
Yeah.
ability to focus on just what we can focus on. But I know that the work that Dr. Weislogel was doing actually flew on the International Space Station. He had several flights where we engineered troughs that were flowing a simulated. It was actually, I think, an orange fruit drink. Um, just to, not with plants. He actually engineered artificial plants with root zones that would pull up the water nutrient solution as if they were a real root. So he did a lot of analysis that way, just to show that the fluid would move through the channel, and going through a root zone would not disrupt the ability of the channel to maintain and contain the water. So there has been work done to it, but I don't know what the latest state of that research is.
Looking beyond current systems, NASA co sponsored the Deep Space Food Challenge, where you contributed as a lead subject matter expert and advisor. This Deep Space Food Challenge yielded fascinating concepts, including systems growing fungi, insects using artificial photosynthesis, or even specialized cooking appliances like satid. From your perspective, what was the value of this challenge format, and did any particular innovations surprise you or excite you?
So another good question, and the Deep Space Food Challenge, from my perspective, was a big success. It may not have been considered a success by people who uh, were originally around in terms of what the original idea behind the challenge was. The idea behind the challenge, as it was first conceived, was to make sure that in our assessment of all the technologies that were out there being developed across the globe that could benefit the production of plants in space, had we, or food, not just plants, did we miss anything that we could apply in the near term to help, with operations in low Earth orbit heading out onto transit missions to Mars? So it wasn't looking at surface systems.
Hmm.
The folks who were originally doing the canvassing before the challenge came up felt that we hadn't missed anything significant. And I think the reality from that perspective is that that's true. There was no big aha, earth shaking moment. Um, but if you just stop there, you miss, I think, the real benefits from the challenge. Because what we got to see was people who are really interested in the idea of growing plants or food in space. They may have come from a terrestrial background. They may have been a plant focused group. They may have been companies. They may have been researchers in academia. They may have been, in one case, somebody working in their garage. And and so it was that stimulating the innovation and the interest that was a big part of it.
Hmm.
At the end of the day, that one of the challenges we gave people were being as sustainable as possible. And so that brought in these novel concepts where in growing plants is not anything novel. Growing fungi is not anything novel. People harvest insects. That's not novel. But when you
Hmm.
integrate those three concepts into one system, and where you have the plant waste or the fungi waste being a source for the insects, or you have plant waste potentially eventually can be a substrate for the plants, and now I have plants that are putting out CO2, and the fungi are taking advantage of that. So this circular agriculture process demonstrated in what's really the size of a big cabinet
Hmm.
was interesting. We hadn't really anticipated production hardware, but and we didn't write our rules to allow or negate production hardware.
Hmm.
Sated came in as a microgravity appliance for food preparation. Um, it fit all the categories, and for a while we were looking at it somewhat skeptical because we're saying it's not producing anything. But at the end of the day, when you look at it, we don't have processing hardware that's unique for handling bulk ingredients, for example.
Hmm.
So again, this is a case where the challenge participants probably surprised us and opened our thinking.
Okay.
And that's why, at the end of the day, when I stepped back from the food challenge, it had all of the team leads um, realize that we had been focusing on technologies, and that what we really should be doing going forward is focusing on the food systems approach, because we hadn't given much thought to the nutritional output of a system. Any
Hmm.
one ingredient, that's fine, but how do I uh, select the ingredients based on the ability to incorporate the infrastructure that produces them, and then balance them in terms of the nutritional capabilities of what the product was going to be.
Hmm.
And then how do I bring someone in to say, I'm going to be able to make food and meals out of these ingredients that the crew are going to enjoy, and how can I do that and increase the variety? And and so it was clear that the Deep Space Food Challenge was just the first step in a longer process, and I think that's what we're trying to proceed on with now that the challenge is done.
Ralph, internationally, organizations like ESA with its Melissa project are also advancing space life support. What's your perspective on the global landscape? Is it more collaborative or competitive? And are there different philosophical approaches being taken?
So I'll take the last one first.
Hmm.
Yes, there are different philosophical approaches being taken. Um, is it collaborative or competitive? Yes, to both of those as well, depending on the situation. I think what I see is that even within NASA, with the different field centers, there were people working in different aspects of food. And to a certain extent, silos were going up, and work that being done at one field center, um, and a lot of times it would be somewhat close vested in terms within that organization, partly because that was their charter to do that kind of work, partly because people were so focused doing the work that they didn't have a chance really to collaborate and coordinate and see what others at other centers were doing. And if I take that whole that as a model for the broader food space, it's even exponential when I consider globally. There are
Mm-hmm.
people in different countries, different within either corporate, and with corporate ties or with academic ties, and in some cases they're going down parallel paths. And
Mm-hmm.
so to me, there can be wasted effort there. In a lot of cases, some people don't know what others are doing. They might be stuck in a certain area where a group in another country has already solved that, and they have the answer there if they would just know that they existed. So part of what we're trying to do is really assess the overall landscape, to see what are different entities, organizations doing, whether they're in Japan with JAXA, whether they're in Australia working in plants for space, whether they're in ESA with Melissa, whatever, whether they're companies like one of the groups that came out of the food challenge that I don't think we were aware of internationally was Solar Foods. And
Mm-hmm.
Solar Foods is a company out of Finland, and they make a single cell protein that they've commercialized. They have a big factory that is being built, or is built now, and others in the works. They've already got their food safety approvals from Singapore. And here's a case where, and I think this is the ideal scenario for an agency like NASA, where NASA doesn't have to develop this technology.
Mm-hmm.
It's already existing, and we know about it now. And now it's just a matter of, how do I adapt that production technique into a space flight environment? So there's a lot of people out there doing different things, different areas. I am a bit very interested now in looking at fermentation and how do I incorporate fermentation practices and techniques, because I can use waste plant matter to
Mm-hmm.
close a waste stream. By using it, I can take portion of what I produce and make other varieties out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So there are so many different groups doing so many interesting things, and it's kind of like a giant puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
You want to make sure, before you start assembling the puzzle, you want to get as many pieces as you can, because that's going to help
Mm-hmm.
you put it together quicker.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're trying to do right now, making a lot of connections, a lot of collaborations. And when you start scratching the surface, you wind up realizing that people that know people that and it's very rarely that you come across somebody who hasn't heard of what another person is doing. But to get that open and that awareness brought to the broader community can be a challenge. And that's kind of what we're trying to do right now, is find all those individual pieces, make sure that they know that the others exist, and then logically and smartly putting them all together in such a
Mm-hmm.
way that we can expedite the process without doing a lot of duplicity of effort.
How would you compare the West's space crop systems with that of China? How far ahead or behind are they?
That's really an unknown for me. I have seen just images of what the Chinese have flown, and it looks fairly similar to our basic research facilities.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that what they have been better at, and other places have done as well, is creating the terrestrial technology and platforms to evaluate food production in a spaceflight environment, but doing it terrestrially. Doing the actual fundamental research of saying, hey, I have this much space, I can produce this variety of things, I can get this nutrition out of it. How do I get into the crop scheduling aspect, different crops? So that kind of thing has been done better by others than NASA has. We've been
Mm-hmm.
very technology driven. Others have actually done a better job of how do you operationally put larger concepts into use and validate them. And I think that it's not just China. The German Space Agency, DLR, did something similar with the Eden ISS facility. And I think, personally, my belief is that when I look at these future food systems, it's going to be a lot of the innovation and maybe even the responsibility for their development will probably be a combination of international partners and then private industry doing that.
Hmm.
It won't be within NASA. NASA's charter isn't food. I think we're going to be paring things down to focus on the how to get there and how to set up the architecture and infrastructure just to keep humans alive and do the exploration. How I actually feed them as part of keeping them alive, I think you're going to see that being,
Hmm.
offloaded to international collaborations,
Yeah.
international groups.
Yeah, I also read somewhere that that on China's Tiangong space station, Chinese astronauts are now eating fresh food with like dumpling, and are moving away from dehydrated food packages, which
Yeah,
is
so
something.
that's I haven't followed that closely. I would be very interested to understand the extent of what they're eating fresh as it relates to their complete diet and how they maintain the food safety aspects. I would not sell them short, but one of the things about how we work is that we don't really collaborate with China, for good or bad, depending on how your philosophy is associated with that. And one of the other things and I'm not saying this just in reference to what you brought up, but in
Mhm,
general, you will see a lot of groups, organizations, companies putting out a lot of information that is really marketing their perspective and what they're doing. And when you really dig into it,
mhm,
it's frequent that there's not as much there as the claims are, because it's a
mhm.
very competitive space, and so you have to get attention first. So I always take everything with a grain of salt and don't really react to it until I've had a chance to look at it in detail to see what's really there.
Okay, so developing these systems is obviously incredibly complex. So now let's pivot to some of the major hurdles and opportunities involved. You've often highlighted that managing water and air delivery to roots in microgravity is perhaps the biggest challenge. Why is something seemingly simple on Earth so difficult in space, and how clear are we to truly close to be to a truly reliable solution?
I think, again, another interesting comment. I think when I look at what it means to be in a microgravity environment for an extended period of time, I think that the general population oversimplifies the impacts and the effects and the challenges associated with it. Humans have evolved to grow up in a gravity vector, and there's a whole lot of aspects of that we were learning about now, and
Hmm.
that we probably just took for granted. So I think there are so many challenges, and that's still going on with what happens in low Earth orbit. When you look at the health impacts to astronauts who've had long stays on the International Space Station, you have the issue with bone density, with the ocular questions that have
Hmm.
emerged medically. Um, and then when you start thinking about, okay, now I'm going, deep space, I'm going outside of the protective radiation Van Allen belts that isolate us to a certain extent from galactic cosmic radiation and high energy solar particle events, and I'm going into a threat area where now I'm going to be there for a while. Well, we
Hmm.
have to understand, what are the impacts of that. What when I My sample size of people who've actually done that is very small,
Hmm.
and we weren't really monitoring the Apollo astronauts, I don't think, long term after their missions. So um, we still have a lot to learn and identify, what issues may have they experienced later in life that were a result of that exposure versus were just normal parts of aging for them.
Hmm.
So there's a lot in terms of challenges we need to take. Even when I look at what does it take to really understand growing plants in a microgravity or partial gravity environment. When
Hmm.
I retired, we had a list of gaps we
Yeah, this
identified.
is a question I wanted to actually ask you about. Like beyond gravity, deep space missions face hurdles like intense radiation,
Yeah.
extreme resource scarcity, power, water, mass.
Right. So there are all those higher level issues that we can all think of. But if you talk to the plant physiologists and the plant scientists, they will drill down and
Hmm.
we have a list of probably 10 or 15 things that need to be addressed that are far below the surface. So things are never as simple as we think they should be.
Okay, so using the gap list framework you and your team utilized, which challenges do you feel are largely resolved? Which are we are actively grappling with now, and what are the unknown unknowns that keep you up at night?
Okay, so again, we've demonstrated that certain plant species can grow well in a microgravity environment. A lot of them can. If we had to depend on what could perform in microgravity, we would be fine. If that's where we were, we would optimize our production strategy. We would feel out how do we go ahead and take systems and grow multiple plants within the same space.
Hmm.
Some plants compete with each other and don't do well. Some do well. We would understand the optimal recipes, whether that's a combination of lighting and nutrients. We would
Hmm.
figure out how to optimize that process, how to schedule things, and
Hmm.
how to be able to harvest and monitor their health so that we maximize what the outputs would be. Those are all details that have to be worked out, but we could figure them out, and they would be on the list if doing this in low Earth orbit was a real priority. Now, we will demonstrate things in low Earth orbit first because it's always easier to get access there than it is to get access on the surface of the moon
Hmm.
or on Mars. So we have to do as much as we can in the environments that we have access to. And then that's why the most of the work happens on the ground first. So you validate as much as you can on the ground, and then you see what is that removal of the gravity vector do?
Hmm.
How does that affect what you've experienced in ground testing? And now we move into the environment, deep space with radiation and partial gravity. And that's something that, again, we're going to have to validate. And so the challenge becomes, as hard as it may have been over the past 20 years to get access on the International Space Station to conduct research, that platform has been up there for and occupied for 20 plus years, and the opportunities are there. But when I start talking about the moon or in lunar space, if we consider Gateway, the station that
Hmm.
they're looking to build around the moon, the opportunities are going to be far less. You're going to have less ability for that. You're going to have less time in that environment, at first. And so that becomes the real challenge. How do you do the things to validate all your techniques and technologies and operations in a partial gravity environment when you're very limited to access?
Hmm.
That's why one of the interesting concepts for me is the folks at VAST are looking at an artificial gravity system where they're basically going to be taking a number of their habitation modules that will probably similar to the ones that will make up or will be like Haven 1 that they're getting ready to fly next year, I believe, and then
Hmm.
Haven 2, but they're going to integrate them into basically a stick configuration and then
Hmm.
rotate it. And with the thought that they'll be able to generate um, a range of gravity vectors in there. And
Hmm.
so when you can do something like that at a scale in low Earth orbit where I might have a whole module that I could populate and do experiments in a lunar gravity environment,
Hmm.
that becomes another way of cheating the system, so to speak, because I can do that in Leo, which is
Hmm.
much easier to get to and more effective than doing it beyond Leo. But I think the big issue that I would see facing us is that I have this range of ideas and concepts that I needed to prove out first on the ground, then I needed to validate them in low Earth orbit, and now I need to revalidate them for the radiation and partial gravity environment,
Hmm.
and I'll have less opportunity to be able to do that. So it's really the time it's going to take to do that work.
Okay. And what about the unknown unknown? Do you have something that like I don't even know what's like
I
how
mean,
to even approach this if
yeah,
one
the
is
the
weird?
the unknown unknowns, they're out there. Like, there are things that we don't know. Seed propagation. Ultimately, you don't want to have to rely on seed shipments for plants. I'm just using this
Hmm.
as an example. You want to be able to propagate, grow from seed to seed. Well, we
Hmm.
don't know really over multi generations what those seeds will be or won't be like. Will there be as
Mutations
many
and
seeds? Or, so the mutations in there, those are unknowns.
hmm.
You can do some testing on the ground, but multi-generation like that we just haven't done.
Hmm.
Then there's I can just look at the concept of regolith as a potential substrate. People are there's a lot of interest in that because I think ever since the Martian, and maybe even before that, people look at that and that sticks in their mind and says, "Wow, this is how we can do things." Um, but even so, we know now that yeah, you've got ingredients in the regolith both on the moon and Mars that it's not necessarily conducive to plant growth. You've got some nutrients depending, but what's the ability of plants to access those nutrients that's captured in the regolith, and
Hmm.
then you've got just the shape and the of the regolith material itself, the lack of weathering on the moon, the over weathering on Mars, which has led to you know ingredients that are not conducive to plant growth. The whole idea of remediating that material, turning it into a usable soil by augmenting it with nutrients. That's a process that we're checking out on the ground. But I sit there and think to myself, every other uh, group is trying to figure out how to keep that dust and that material outside of the habitable environment because it's a health hazard,
Hmm.
and people are talking about bringing it in. So, what are we going to do in that regard? Does that make sense? Are there mitigation strategies? Is there an advantage, in the midterm to be using regolith versus hydroponics? We haven't, answered some of those basic questions yet. Um, so unknown unknowns, it's tough because there, I think what you'll see is that there'll be environmental impacts on the performance not only of the crew members who are there, but the life that we bring along with it to
Hmm.
support them. That that time is going to reveal.
Okay. So, how does the need to incorporate these food production systems, which require power, water, volume, and they also generate heat and gases, impact the overall design of a, let's say, trans Mars spacecraft?
So I think there's an interesting historical aspect to this question.
Hmm.
From the dawn of the U.S. space program, probably the same thing for the Soviet space program at the time. Um, we were bringing up food, so food wasn't a system; it was a commodity. Um, Food wasn't impacting the other systems except through the crew members who were consuming the food and then getting rid of the food. So now you have everybody fighting for their resource piece of the pie. You only have any vehicle, you only have so much capability, and that's power, water, mass, all the different things that you could put up there
Hmm.
that are resources, and everybody's been arguing and fighting over them, and they kind of get into some equilibrium over time for each vehicle scenario. And now all of a sudden in comes this new guy in the room, which is food production. And like, to make room for him, everybody's got to give up something, and
Something.
nobody wants to give up something. And so, at a certain level, there's pushback. Um, and then eventually there's going to come a realization. I mean, that for surface systems, there's a realization that, hey, we're going to have to do something different. And so then it's a matter of, well, how do we play with the food production people? Again, I'll use veggie and advanced plant habitat as an example. On one hand, veggie will have an impact on the life support system that's currently on the ISS, right?
Hmm.
Minimal impact. But if I'm going to extrapolate this to some future capability and I'm expanding what I'm actually growing, now that impact on the life support system has to be taken into account when I develop the life support system.
Hmm.
Or I close everything into its own area, and now the life support system for the vehicle crew combination is potted, but now I've got to duplicate that to a certain extent for the plant system, and that's more mass, that's more power, that's more everything. So that's an
Tough one.
interesting quandary
Yeah.
to see how we go. I think when I retired, we kind of put a target out there several years down the road to determine, when it came to crop production on transit missions, would they be an open system or a closed system?
Hmm.
And then you can argue it just from that mass trade or resource trade perspective. But then if you bring in things out of the blue, like, well, having crew get access to plants that they may not even consume, but just for a psychosocial benefit in their environment, now that's a whole other, that's an unknown that, as you talk unknowns, we wouldn't have planned for 5, 10 years ago. So
Ultimately, astronauts have to want to eat food. How much does crew preference and organoleptic acceptability, like taste, texture, variety, factor into crop selection and system design?
it's huge. It's that for any aspect of food. When you look at it again, to me, we really have to go through this paradigm shift of not focusing, like I said, on any one technology or any one product. We have to
Hmm.
focus on, my food has to be safe. That's got to be the bottom line.
Hmm.
That it has to be able to provide the nutrition that the crew members need in the
Hmm.
amounts that they need it. We can't be we can't be providing more of the nutritional items, vitamins, minerals that they need, and we can't be providing less. So in an optimal fashion, we would love to be able to have a way to individually prescribe the through the foods for individual crew members based on their specific individual needs. Um, and the variety is part of the palatability aspect, because you get bored. I mean, I actually did a study with myself, a non-scientific study, where there's certain foods that I really, really enjoy. And if I eat them at a frequency that resonates with me, I
Hmm.
won't get tired of them. But if I have to eat them at a higher rate than I normally would, I'm done.
Hmm.
I think most people are like that. So
Yeah.
that's where, even simple things like the preparation, the actual meal, that is selection, can use the same ingredients but prepare them in a different way to increase variety. So I can have a world-class chef and I can give him 10 ingredients,
Hmm.
and he might be able to prepare a range of meals that are just exquisite and you love. But if you were to take those same 10 ingredients and figure out what to do with them, you'd be
Hmm.
stuck in like 3 meals and they'd probably all be, less than satisfactory. So
True.
so really, it's those things are really important when it comes to a food system,
Hmm.
and then selecting the products becomes important. You have to, even from the plant perspective, and I'll use this as an example. I might, as a plant scientist, want to be able to study hundreds of different plants for their potential. And
Hmm.
maybe in some point, because there's so many players out there, they can do that.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, if I'm a chef preparing meals, I might say, as long as I can reliably produce and have access to these 10, 12, 15 plants,
Hmm.
I can make such a variety of foods or menu additions that people aren't going to get tired of them. So the question then is, well, how many do I really need to,
Okay.
investigate then? Now, the other thing that's interesting, and I have colleagues who I coordinate with, is the cultural impact that new foods have.
Hmm.
From a Western perspective, it works two ways. From a Western diet, which is kind of what we here model things on, first of all, it's not always the best diet,
Hmm.
and it's probably a little bit less diverse than other diets. So if you factor all that out, you would like to be able to bring in new alternatives. And especially as the diversity of the crews changes,
Hmm.
you want to take advantage of some foods that might be consumed in different cultures that check all of our boxes, but not well known yet
Hmm.
to the traditional Western diet. And we want to be able to introduce those things, especially when I look at, again, the health perspective. When I start talking about nutrition, and we now know about the importance of the gut microbiome and the brain microbiome, and what types of foods enhance the microbiome of your gut and brain in
Hmm.
such a way that you want to be able to maximize that diversity and that health for the health of the astronaut. And so that might mean adding foods that culturally are less familiar. In
Hmm.
some cases, those foods will be enjoyed. And so I think now that this is all part of over the next 10, 20 years, as we start sharing culturally diverse meals
Mm-hmm.
within Western culture and they become more mainstream, it becomes easier to introduce those into a space flight scenario when people are used to them and enjoy them and understand the health benefits of eating those kind of foods.
Okay. So let me follow up on this. Fast forward 30 years. If we have astronauts living and working on Mars or in orbit around Mars, what does mealtime look like?
Well, you know, uh, this is my personal opinion. Well, I know that a lot of people that I work with in this area, they have an appreciation for early polar exploration, and
Hmm.
there is a very interesting set of parallels between polar exploration and space exploration, and one of the big ones is how mealtime was, and we see that on the ISS today. Mealtime was an opportunity for the crew members to get together, gather around, share a little bit about the challenges and the activities they did that day, bond together as a crew. There is a behavioral impact. If we think about the holidays when our families get together, there's always something special about that time. Here in the US, our culture has kind of drifted away from that. Everybody in a family may eat individually at different times, but that removes the opportunity for them to get together, bond and share and talk, relieve stress. So I think mealtime, that's a big aspect. You are going to see a place, a designated place to
Hmm.
set up and consume those meals. I think, ideally you're going to see the environment and the design of that space being
Hmm.
one that's welcoming. Psychologically, it doesn't take much to make a space, an attractive space and an inviting space, as opposed to some sanitized and laboratory environment that has no warmth to it. So
Okay.
I think you're going to see that. I think you're going to see a range of foods. I think you're going to see plants will be a large portion of that diet. There'll be pick and eat plants, salad type crops. You'll see some staple crops grown in there at the time. You're going to see foods produced in a bioreactor. They could be fungi based, meat substitutes. You
Hmm.
might you might even see, we get really sporty out there, 3D printed foods. 3D printed foods have the ability to tailor the nutrients based on the ingredients. There's people out there who promote the variety of shapes and textures you can make as
Hmm.
being an enhancer. I think that's down the road. I think the space you'd allocate for something is seemingly less important than the actual produce itself, is how you shape it for enjoyment and diversity. That might be a little bit out there, but ultimately at the end of the day, you're going to see all these things. You're going to see um, foods that are a way to recapture some of the ingredients that went into producing them.
Hmm.
You're going to have a way of scavenging some of the waste products to actually make new foods.
Hmm.
You're going to see all of this, and ultimately, when you have the right nutritionists and chefs around, the crew members are not going to really notice the details of what went into making them. They
Okay.
will be operating systems that will be largely autonomous. You don't want crew members to have to be putting effort into their meals. You want it to be an enjoyment process. So
Okay.
anything we can do to remove the crew from having to do certain tasks, you want to be able to do. You want to be able for the crew to interact wherever they can and want to. You don't
Hmm.
want to take that enjoyment experience away from them, but you don't want it to be a burden.
Hmm.
And you're going to have the ability to monitor the safety of the food in real time, the nutrition that the astronauts require in real time. But you're going to want to be able to do this, like I said, as innocuously as possible. You don't want it to be something where and there's already approaches, in terms of software to be able to help monitor
Hmm.
processes, the HACCP process throughout your food production, sphere. And so I think that's going to be the goal. You want that to be the place that the crew members can come and not feel stress, but actually relieve stress through that activity, kind of like they did back in the early early polar days where, you came together and it was the shared experience and that bonding.
Cool. What's the single most exciting development or capability in spacecraft production that you anticipate seeing become operational in the next 5 to 10 years?
I will have to put a plug in for again for the OAP014 mission, because
Hmm.
that was an idea that came up several years ago when we were talking about supplemental crop production systems for a Mars transit mission. At this time, we had actually showed that we can grow plants and we could consume them on the International Space Station. But again, they were in research facilities and they were one offs. You would have a mission that would last for a few months, and then the payload would be dormant until the next science came up for it. So the question was, how feasible is it to do continuous crop production? So that's where the idea for a Hollow 3 came in. And it'll, like I said, it'll be hopefully flying next year. And so this is actually focused on crop production. It's not a research facility in and of itself. The research we're gaining is the performance of a system like this continuously. What are the failure modes? What is the ability to keep the produce that comes out of it healthy, clean, safe?
Hmm.
And look at it sustainably, because ultimately it's the one test we're going to have until some other commercial platform comes up and maybe tries to duplicate that, and there are people talking about that, before you're actually going to be able to take a system like this on a mission to Mars or set something up on the moon.
Hmm.
So there's others out there working similar concepts, but this is the first one that's really going to fly, and sustainably be used, hopefully till the end of station life.
Ralph, what's your favorite science fiction book?
Ugh, you're not going to like this. I'm not a real science fiction fan. I'm actually, and in a way, I think it's a positive thing. I'm a history buff, so
Hmm.
to me, history is really important, and that's why I go back and I look at the history of. Now I look at the history of food, and I've come across some interesting things. That I saw uh, a section out of one book that was done by a physician who worked for the Royal Navy back in the 1700s,
Hmm.
and they were talking about the importance for fresh fruit and vegetables wherever they could access them, wherever they had a port of call. But in the absence of fresh vegetables, they talked about how when there were rainstorms out, that crew could just lay blankets on the decks of the sailing ships and sprinkle them with seeds, and a couple of weeks later they would have greens to grow. And that's microgreens. And this is, I'm like, and then there's stories like that, and that has me realize that nothing we're doing now is really new and novel in terms of what we're trying to do. It's just where we're trying to do it. And to certain extents that's true. Maybe some extent, when I think of fermented foods have been around for generations. We've known about all these things, but now how do you incorporate them in a space flight environment?
Hmm.
I think what we're doing now in terms of using bioreactives to make a lot of food sustainably quickly, that's an optimization. But yeah, so from a science fiction perspective, I think if I can step away from books and into movies, I think the thing that made the biggest impression on me was seeing 2001: A Space Odyssey when it first came out, because back then, at least to me, and I think even to this day, it lays out an almost credible scenario for what things could be like. It wasn't so
Hmm.
over the top, and I could see that being the future. And I think
Okay.
that's the problem I have, is a lot of science fiction is so far out there. It's in the fiction realm with a science spin to it. I
Hmm.
like the science realm with a little bit of fiction added onto it.
Okay. Got you. Um, for students and young professionals listening, perhaps engineers, biologists, designers, or even computer scientists, for those who are inspired by this field, what advice would you give them if they want to contribute to the future of space agriculture?
First thing I would say is any opportunity you have to reach out and make contact with somebody, take advantage of. I can't overly express how important it's been to meet a whole range of people that at the time I never knew if I would see this person again, and then they have come back in my life, and time and time and time again. So it's who in a lot of ways. Always be open to alternative viewpoints. It's
Hmm.
very easy to get all excited about a specific approach and want to champion that approach. But there are times where, that approach may not be the best one. And if you put too much of yourself in it, now you're fighting against the reality. So be open to new ideas, new prospects. How do you take what you've learned and fit it as a piece of the puzzle into, another part of the puzzle?
Hmm.
I think that's hugely important. I think don't be distracted from following your dream. It's a very, you know, the the competition for smart people who are interested in this field, it's very challenging. I would say also don't target anyone uh, like university or organization just because historically you've always had an affinity for that group. Be very open. Also be open to international aspects where there are opportunities that could pop up. um, and then, like I said earlier, make sure you do your best to vet things. A lot of these really appealing ideas, you want to see how practical they are.
Hmm.
Too often we get so enamored with the technology that we don't think far enough ahead to see how does that really fit and play out. And I guess for me, I would say, always try to have a little bit of time reserved so that you can look up from what your niche is so that you can see the forest for the trees and make sure you're heading in the right direction.
Great. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience? Any announcements?
Let's see, announcements. No, I think that we're on the cusp of developing this deep space food consortium that's, like I said, trying to really canvas the entire spectrum of what's going on in the space food space. And I think hopefully something on that line will come out in the next several months. We also, in a microcosm of how something like that will work, I'll put a plug in for this mission that we just completed, science research we just completed on the SpaceX Fram 2 mission,
Hmm.
where we were able to fly mushrooms, oyster mushrooms, sporeless oyster mushrooms, for the first time, and actually got to see some fruiting, and we had to see some colonization. It was a very short turnaround opportunity that came up. And here's where the connections part comes in. The opportunity was provided to a researcher, Dr. Flavia Fayette Moore, who works for Food IQ. She's the owner of Food IQ Global in Australia.
Hmm.
She had the opportunity because on this Fram 2 mission, I guess a little space came up at the very end, and there was an Australian crew member, and he was all interested in having an Australian science experiment going on board there. So um, she reached out to me again. This is the whole collaboration contact thing, because several years earlier she had reached out to me when she was going to International Space University,
Hmm.
and so she reached out to me to get some insights into how to get this thing to fly and how would we actually tailor the science. Um, so I helped her a little bit there, but being in Australia, she really needed somebody on the ground here in Florida, because that's where we were going to be turning over the science from, to kind of pull this
Hmm.
together. And so one of the a student who was working as on one of the Deep Space Food Challenge teams.
Hmm.
I met her as part of the Deep Space Food Challenge. I knew she was working in fungi and mushrooms. She happened to, after the challenge, get an internship at NASA at Kennedy. So
Hmm.
I got in contact with her, and she was able to help. And so here we, fast forward like 2 weeks later, and now we've got this little team of 3 people, focusing on their areas of expertise, and we got the science to fly. And what from from me being an old NASA guy was like an insane record time. Um, and we got to make it happen. And so, that's, I guess, my little plug is just the appreciation, to be able to do that kind of thing, just to play
Hmm.
even a small part in it, and
Hmm.
just to show the importance of meeting people and making contacts and not forgetting who these people are.
Hmm.
Keep them in a database that you have someplace, because you never know when the opportunity is going to arise. And if you stay in this area long enough, that it will arise. So
Hmm.
that's it.
Ralph, thank you so much for sharing your invaluable experience and insights with us today.
Thank you. I hope I didn't bore you too much.
No, definitely not. To our listeners, Join us next time on the Omar Alayli podcast as we continue to explore the science.